The road out of town was a ribbon of dust. It clung to the hem of her light brown dress. The sun beat down. Wagons passed, their drivers turning their faces away. The orphanage gate had closed with a final, metallic sound. Her bundle was small. It held a tin cup, a thin blanket, and a piece of hard bread. She walked until the town was a smudge on the horizon. The flat land gave way to low, rolling hills. Scrub brush and rock littered the ground. She did not look back. Her shoes were worn through at the toes. The grey scarf around her neck was thin, a poor shield against the wind that started to rise. She kept her eyes on the hills. They promised nothing, but the town had promised less. She followed a dry creek bed, the stones shifting under her feet. It led her toward a darker line of trees, a forest clinging to the base of a larger hill. The air grew cooler here. The scent of pine and damp earth replaced the dust. She saw the opening from a distance. It was a dark mouth in the hillside, half hidden by overgrown bushes. Timbers, grey and splintered with age, framed the entrance. A rusted iron rail snaked out from the darkness and disappeared into a patch of weeds. It was a mine. Abandoned. Forgotten. The company had left years ago. The townspeople said it was played out, that the earth had given all it had to give. She stood before it. The wind rustled the leaves around her. Inside, there was only silence and shadow. She felt a draft of cool, still air touch her face. It smelled of stone and deep water. She looked back at the open country, the vast, empty sky. Then she looked into the mine. She pushed aside a thick branch. The entrance was low. She had to stoop to enter. The darkness swallowed her whole. The light from the entrance faded to a small, bright coin behind her. She took another step, her hand trailing along the cold, rough wall. The ground was uneven, littered with fallen rock and rotting wood. She stopped, letting her eyes adjust. The silence was absolute. It was a silence that had weight, pressing in from all sides. She took a breath. The air was clean, without the stench of coal dust she had expected. It was just cool and earthy. She could see vague shapes now. The tunnel went straight for a time, then seemed to open into a larger chamber. She walked forward slowly, her feet shuffling to feel for obstacles. Her hand never left the wall. It was her only guide. The small bundle in her other hand felt heavy, the sum of her life. Here, in the dark, it was just a thing to be carried. She reached the chamber. It was not large, perhaps the size of 2 wagons side by side. The ceiling was higher here. A faint crack of light from a fissure high above gave the darkness a milky quality. She could make out piles of rubble, a broken pickaxe handle, the skeletal remains of a wooden cart. This was a place where men had worked. Where they had torn rock from the earth. Now it was just a hole. An empty space. She walked to the center of the chamber and set down her bundle. She unwrapped the bread and ate half of it, chewing slowly. The water in her canteen was warm and tasted of metal. She drank a little. She sat on a flat rock. The chill of the stone seeped through her thin dress. This was a decision. The town was behind her. The open road offered only wind and hunger. This place offered shelter. It was dark and cold, but it was out of the wind. It was a start. She stood up. She began to work. She started with the small rocks. She picked them up one by one and carried them to a corner of the chamber. Her hands were small, but she was methodical. She did not rush. Each rock moved was a small victory against the chaos. The larger stones took more effort. She had to roll them, her slight frame straining against their weight. Sweat beaded on her forehead, cold in the subterranean air. She worked until the light from the entrance was gone and the fissure above was a pale grey smudge. She had cleared a space. It was not large, but it was flat. It was hers. She unrolled her thin blanket in the cleared space. She lay down, her back against the hard ground. The chill was deep. Sleep did not come easily. Every sound was magnified in the silence. The drip of water somewhere in the darkness. The scuttling of some small creature in the rubble. The sound of her own breathing. She was 16. She was alone. She was in a hole in the ground. But she was not on the road. She was not begging at a back door. She closed her eyes. The darkness inside the mine was the same as the darkness behind her eyelids. It was complete. She listened to the slow, steady drip of water. It was the only clock she had. Each drop marked another moment she had survived. She woke to the faint light filtering through the fissure. The air was cold enough to see her breath. Her body ached from the hard ground and the labor of the previous day. She ate the other half of her bread. She knew she could not stay deep in the mine without light. The entrance chamber was the only viable place. But it was exposed. She needed a way to close it off, to make it secure. She spent the morning exploring the tunnels near the entrance. They were choked with debris, but some were stable. In a side passage, she found a small cache of miners' tools, left behind in the company's haste. A shovel with a cracked handle. A heavy sledgehammer, its head pitted with rust. A dented tin bucket. And 3 miners' lamps, their glass globes miraculously intact. There was no oil for them, but they were a promise of light. She carried the tools back to her cleared space. The shovel was her first priority. She found a sturdy piece of fallen timber and spent hours painstakingly fitting it to the shovel head, securing it with strips of leather she cut from her worn-out shoes. It was clumsy, but it worked. With the shovel, the work of clearing became faster. She moved earth and gravel, not just rocks. She expanded her living space, pushing the walls of debris farther back. She found a seam of dry clay in one wall. She scraped it out with her hands and the tin cup, collecting it in the bucket. She remembered seeing men in town mix clay with water and straw to patch their walls. She had straw. The ground outside the mine was covered in dry, tough grass. She gathered armfuls of it, carrying it back into the darkness. She used the bucket to haul water from a puddle near the entrance, likely runoff from a recent rain. In her cleared space, she mixed the clay, water, and grass with her bare feet, stomping and turning it until it became a thick, cohesive mud. It was cold and squelched between her toes, but she did not stop. She began to seal the cracks in the rock walls around her space. She pushed the mud into the fissures, smoothing it with her palms. It was slow, messy work. The mud clung to her hands and her dress. But as it dried, it hardened, blocking the small drafts that chilled the air. It was a small change, but she could feel it. The air in her space felt stiller, heavier. It felt separate from the rest of the mine. Her next task was a door. The entrance was too wide to block completely. But she could build a barrier, something to break the wind and discourage animals. She dragged the old, splintered timbers from the mine entrance. They were heavy, waterlogged, and covered in moss. She laid them across the entrance, one on top of the other. It was not a wall, but a screen. It left a small opening, just big enough for her to crawl through. It was enough. It changed the feeling of the place. The open mouth of the cave was now a guarded entrance. The light that came through was filtered, dappled. Her home was no longer just a part of the mine, it was a room within it. Fire was the next necessity. She could not survive the nights without warmth. She gathered dry wood from the forest, breaking branches into manageable lengths. Inside, she built a small fire pit with flat stones, lining it carefully. She had no matches. She had seen a man start a fire once with a piece of flint and steel. She searched the creek bed outside, looking for the right kind of rock. She found a hard, grey stone that sparked when struck against the back of her knife, the only other thing in her bundle besides the cup and blanket. She shredded dry bark into a tiny nest. She struck the flint against her knife again and again. Sparks flew, dying in the air. Her knuckles were raw. Frustration was a cold knot in her stomach, but she did not let it show on her face. She focused on the task. The angle of the strike. The fineness of the tinder. Finally, a spark caught. A tiny ember glowed in the bark. She blew on it gently, coaxing it. A wisp of smoke, then a tiny flame. She fed it twigs, then larger sticks. The fire grew. It pushed back the darkness and the chill. The light flickered against the rock walls, making shadows dance. The smoke was a problem. It filled the small chamber, making her eyes water and her throat burn. She realized the fire had to be near the entrance, where the draft could pull the smoke out. She moved the fire pit stone by stone. She sat by the new fire, just inside her timber screen. The smoke now curled upwards and out the opening. The heat warmed her face. She watched the flames. They were life. They were warmth. They were a weapon against the night. She had a sealed room, a screened door, and a fire. It was not a home. Not yet. But it was a place to survive. He came on the third week. She was outside, gathering firewood, when she saw him. He was standing near the creek bed, watching her. He was an old man, his face a roadmap of scars. One eye was clouded over. He wore clothes that were patched and faded. He held a walking stick. He did not speak. She froze, her arms full of branches. Her first instinct was to run, to retreat into the safety of her cave. But she stood her ground. She met his gaze. He looked at her, then at the entrance to the mine. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees as silently as he had appeared. She waited, her heart pounding. He did not return. The encounter left her unsettled. She was no longer completely alone. Someone knew she was here. For the next few days, she was extra cautious. She made her fire smaller, to produce less smoke. She stayed inside the mine unless it was necessary to go out. One morning, she found a rabbit, cleaned and skinned, lying on a flat rock just outside her entrance. There were no tracks. No sign of who had left it. She knew it was him. She hesitated, suspicious. But hunger won. She roasted the meat over her fire. It was the first real meal she had eaten in weeks. The taste was rich, life-giving. A few days later, he was there again. He was standing inside the entrance chamber, looking at the ceiling. She was deeper inside, in her cleared space, and had not heard him approach. He pointed with his walking stick to a section of the ceiling where a long crack was visible. A fine dust was sifting down from it. He looked at her, then at the pile of discarded timbers she had not used for her door. He did not say a word. He walked over to the timbers. He chose two of the thickest ones. He used the sledgehammer she had found, his movements economical and precise. He wedged one timber upright, like a pillar, directly under the crack. He used the sledge to hammer it tight against the ceiling. The dust stopped falling. He then took the second timber and braced it diagonally, from the top of the pillar to the wall, creating a solid support. He tested it with his weight. It did not move. He had shown her how to secure the mine. How to read the rock. He looked at the support, then at her. He nodded once, the same slow nod as before. Then he left. She stared at the new brace. It was simple, functional, and strong. It was a lesson without words. She understood. This place could be dangerous. The earth was not static. It shifted. It fell. She had to learn its ways. She started to pay more attention. She ran her hands over the walls, feeling for loose rock. She watched the cracks for any sign of change. The old man had taught her to see, not just to look. He returned a week later. This time, he brought something with him. He carried an old canvas sack. He set it down on the ground and pulled out a block of salt and a small bag of cornmeal. He pushed them toward her with his foot. He looked at her small fire pit. He grunted, a low sound of disapproval. He walked outside and came back with 3 large, flat stones. He rearranged her fire pit, creating a small, enclosed oven-like structure. It concentrated the heat, using less wood and producing a brighter, warmer flame. He showed her how to place a flat stone on top to create a cooking surface. He took a pinch of the cornmeal, mixed it with water from her bucket in her tin cup, and made a small, flat cake. He cooked it on the stone. He handed it to her. It was hot and tasted of roasted corn. It was the best thing she had ever eaten. He watched her eat it. Then he stood up and left. She did not know his name. She did not know where he came from. He was just the old man. He was her teacher. He taught her not with words, but with actions. He showed her how to survive, and then how to build. She took the lessons to heart. She started to see the mine not as a hole to hide in, but as a structure to be understood and improved. She began to work with a new purpose. She was not just clearing rubble. She was shaping her world. The brace the old man had built was a revelation. It was a sign that the space could be controlled, made safe. She looked at her small, cleared area. It felt temporary. She needed something more permanent. She needed walls. She went back to the seam of clay she had found. With her repaired shovel and the tin bucket, she began to excavate a larger quantity. It was exhausting work. The clay was dense and heavy. Each bucketful was a struggle. She hauled it back to her living space, trip after trip. She gathered more grass and hauled more water. She made a large pit of mud, mixing it until her legs ached. Her hands were caked with it, her dress stained brown. She began to build a low wall. It started at the edge of her cleared space, curving out to create a more defined room. She did not have bricks or forms. She used what she had learned from patching the cracks. She took large handfuls of the clay mixture and laid them down, one on top of the other, packing them tight. She embedded flat stones into the wall as she went, giving it strength and structure. It was a slow, painstaking process. Each layer had to dry slightly before the next could be added. The wall grew by inches each day. It was not straight or perfect. It followed the natural contours of the floor. It was thick and solid. While the clay wall dried, she turned her attention to the floor. The bare rock was uneven and cold. She decided to pave it. She explored the deeper, more collapsed tunnels, looking for flat stones. She found shale, which split into thin, flat pieces. She used the sledgehammer to break larger rocks, learning how the stone fractured, how to strike it to get the pieces she wanted. She carried the flat stones back, one by one. She laid them over the floor of her new room, fitting them together like a puzzle. She filled the gaps between them with sand and fine gravel, which she carried in the bucket from the creek bed. When she was done, she had a smooth, solid floor. It was still stone, but it was an ordered stone. It was a floor made, not found. The old man appeared again while she was laying the last stones. He watched her for a long time, his one good eye taking in the new wall, the paved floor. He walked over to her wall. He ran a scarred hand over its rough surface. He pressed his thumb into the drying clay. He looked at the stone she had embedded within it. He then walked to a pile of rubble she had not yet cleared. He kicked at a large, squarish rock. He pointed at it, then at a gap in her wall where she planned to leave an opening for a doorway. He was showing her how to make a lintel, a solid stone to span the top of the doorway. He demonstrated how to use smaller rocks as shims, to level the large stone and seat it securely. She watched his hands. They were gnarled and slow, but they knew the language of weight and balance. He did not place the stone for her. He showed her how it should be done. Then he stepped back, leaving the task to her. It took her for tries to get the large stone into place. It was heavy, and her first attempts were clumsy. But she remembered his movements, the way he had used leverage instead of brute force. Finally, the lintel settled into place, solid and unmoving. She had a doorway. He watched her succeed. He gave his familiar, single nod. This time, before he left, he reached into his sack and pulled out a small, folded piece of oilcloth. He handed it to her. Inside was a sewing needle and a spool of thick, waxed thread. It was a gift of immense value. It meant she could mend her clothes, her blanket. She could stitch and repair. He left without another gesture. She looked at the needle in her hand, glinting in the firelight. It was a tool for finer work. A tool for making a house into a home. She looked at her clay wall, her stone floor, her sturdy doorway. The space was no longer a cave. It was a room she had built with her own hands. The work settled into a rhythm. Each day had its tasks. Maintain the fire. Haul water. Check the snares. Work on the home. The home was the center of her world. After the first room was complete, she began to clear another, deeper in the mine. This one would be for storage. A place to keep firewood dry, a place for food. She used the techniques she had learned. She braced the ceiling where it looked weak. She cleared the rubble. She sealed the cracks with clay. The old man had not taught her how to find food, but his gift of the rabbit had been a lesson in itself. The forest was not just trees, it was a larder. She had seen him once, from a distance, checking a line of traps. She had watched how they were made, how they were placed. She began to make her own. She had no wire. She used twisted vines and sinew she laboriously prepared from the rabbit he had given her. Her first snares were failures. They were too clumsy, too obvious. Animals avoided them. She did not grow discouraged. She studied the animal trails. She learned to see the small signs they left behind. She learned to mask her scent with mud and crushed leaves. One day, a snare held a squirrel. It was small, but it was meat. She learned to skin it with her knife, wasting nothing. The pelt was small, but she saved it. Over time, she caught more squirrels, then another rabbit. She learned to cure the small pelts with salt from the block the old man had given her. She began stitching them together with the needle and thread he had provided. It was a slow process, but a small, warm blanket began to take shape. Water was a constant labor. The puddle near the entrance was unreliable. It dried up when the weather was fair. She had to venture farther, to the creek. This was risky. It exposed her. She remembered the constant drip of water she had heard on her first night, deeper in the mine. She decided to find its source. She made a torch from a thick branch wrapped in cloth soaked in rendered animal fat. The light was smoky and dim, but it allowed her to explore beyond her living area. She followed the sound of dripping water down a long, winding tunnel. The air grew damp and cool. Finally, she found it. A slow, steady seep from a fissure in the rock face. The water trickled down the stone into a small, clear pool. It was pure and cold. She tasted it. It was the best water she had ever had. This discovery changed everything. She no longer had to risk going to the creek. She had a secure source of water inside her home. She went into town only twice. She needed things she could not make or find: more salt, a new knife, a cooking pot. She had nothing to trade but scavenged metal. She found old pitons, a broken shovel head, and a length of chain in the abandoned tunnels. She walked to town at dusk, her grey scarf pulled high to hide her face. She went to the blacksmith. He was a large man with soot-stained arms. He looked at the rusted metal she offered. "This is scrap," he said. His voice was rough. She did not reply. She just waited. He weighed the metal in his hand. He looked at her thin frame, her patched dress. He sighed. "Salt and a small pot." "Nothing more," he said. She nodded. He gave her the goods. She gave him the metal. No other words were exchanged. She left the town before sunrise. The brief contact with the world outside reinforced her choice. The town was a place of judgment and commerce. Her home was a place of work and substance. She walked back toward the hills, the heavy iron pot a welcome weight in her hands. The pot meant she could make stew, boil tough roots, render fat more easily. It was another step toward permanence. The old man was there when she returned. He was looking at her line of snares in the woods. One of them held a bird. He was retying the knot on another, showing her a better, more secure way to do it. He saw the pot she carried. He grunted, a sound that might have been approval. He pointed toward the woods, then made a gesture of digging. He was telling her about roots. He left her to her work, as always. She now had walls, a floor, water, and a growing store of food. She had routine. She had a home that was becoming more secure each day. The raw space was becoming a functional one. Now, she began to make it comfortable. She needed a place to sleep that was not the cold stone floor. She built a low platform against the back wall of her room. She used the flattest stones she could find, stacking them carefully to create a solid base about a foot high. On top of this, she laid planks she salvaged from a collapsed section of the mine. They were old and gray, but they were dry. She filled her original, thin blanket with dry leaves and grass, sewing it shut to make a crude mattress. It was lumpy and rustled when she moved, but it lifted her off the stone. The difference was immense. The deep chill no longer seeped into her bones as she slept. Next, she built a table. She found a single, large, flat slab of slate in a far chamber. It was too heavy to carry. She spent 2 days rolling and sliding it back to her room. She built 2 sturdy stone pedestals and carefully balanced the slab on top. It was a solid, level surface. A place to prepare food. A place to mend her clothes. A place to sit and eat. The fire remained the heart of the home. The old man's design for the fire pit was efficient, but she knew it could be better. The smoke still sometimes filled the room when the wind blew from the wrong direction. She studied the high fissure in the ceiling of the first chamber, the one that let in a sliver of light. She realized it could be a chimney. The challenge was directing the smoke toward it. She began to build a hood over her fire pit. She used a framework of green wood, which she bent into a curve. Over this, she plastered a thick layer of her clay and grass mixture. It was delicate work. The hood collapsed twice before she figured out how to support it properly as it dried. When it was finished, it was a rough, cone-shaped structure that sat over the fire pit. The top narrowed and pointed toward the fissure high above. The first time she lit a fire under it, she watched with held breath. The smoke swirled, then was caught by the draft. It rose straight up into the hood and disappeared out of sight. A thin stream of smoke now rose from the hillside, invisible to anyone not looking for it. The air in her room was clear. The fire burned brighter, hotter. The change was transformative. The room was no longer hazy. The walls were not stained with soot. She could breathe freely. The home felt cleaner, healthier. Her small collection of possessions grew. The iron pot. A wooden bowl she found, miraculously intact. Her needle and thread. The blanket she was slowly stitching from cured pelts. Each object had a purpose. There was no clutter. She organized her storage chamber, building shelves from flat stone stacked between upright timbers. One section was for firewood, sorted by size. Another was for food, a small sack of cornmeal, a block of salt, strips of dried meat hanging from a wooden rod. The old man visited during this time. He brought a gift that left her speechless. It was a lantern. Not a simple miner's lamp, but a proper tin lantern with glass panels and a handle. It was old and dented, but the glass was whole and the wick was new. He also brought a small can of oil. He lit the lantern for her. A steady, clean, golden light filled the room. It was a gentle light, so different from the flickering, hungry light of the fire. It did not dance and leap. It was calm. She could carry it with her. She could take it into the storage room, into the deeper tunnels. The darkness of the mine was no longer absolute. He placed the lantern on her new stone table. The light glowed on the slate surface. He looked around the room. He saw the sleeping platform, the smoke-free fire, the ordered shelves visible through the doorway. He looked at her, and his scarred face seemed to soften for a moment. He did not nod this time. He simply turned and walked out, leaving the lantern burning on the table. She sat by the table for hours that night, long after she would normally have gone to sleep. She just watched the steady, quiet flame of the lantern. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. The days grew shorter. The wind that blew across the hills had a new edge to it. The leaves on the few deciduous trees near the creek turned yellow, then brown, and fell. Winter was coming. The townspeople pulled their collars tight and hurried along the wooden sidewalks. They spoke of the first snows in the high country. For them, winter was a hardship. For her, it was a test. Her home was built for this. The earth itself was her insulation. The mine held a constant, cool temperature, impervious to the howling winds and plummeting temperatures outside. Her preparations became more urgent. She spent every daylight hour gathering wood. She did not just gather fallen branches. She used a small, sharp axe head the old man had left for her, which she fitted with a handle, to cut down dead, dry trees. She dragged the logs back to the mine and spent the evenings splitting and stacking them in her storage room. The woodpile grew until it filled an entire wall. She doubled her number of snares, hoping to catch enough game to dry and preserve for the lean months. She gathered pine nuts and edible roots, storing them in cloth sacks. The first snow came at night. She woke to a profound silence. The usual sounds of the forest were gone, muffled by a thick white blanket. She crawled through the opening in her timber wall and looked out. The world was transformed. It was white and clean. The air was sharp and cold. A deep peace settled over the landscape. Back inside, her fire crackled. The warmth was a stark contrast to the frozen world outside. She cooked a stew of dried rabbit and roots in her iron pot. The smell filled her small, warm room. During the day, the filtered light from the entrance was bluer, softer. At night, the fire and the lantern cast a warm, golden glow on the stone walls. She was completely sealed off from the storm. The wind howled over the hill, but inside, she heard only a distant, low moan. There was no draft. Her clay-sealed walls held firm. The stone floor, warmed by the fire, retained a gentle heat long into the night. She spent the days of the first big storm organizing her home. She sewed another small pelt onto her growing blanket. She repaired a tear in her dress with the needle and thread. She ground cornmeal with a smooth, heavy rock. Her life was reduced to simple, essential tasks. There was a purity to it. There was no wasted motion, no wasted thought. She was not lonely. The silence of the mine was a companion. It was a living silence, made of the drip of water in the deep passages, the crackle of the fire, the soft sound of her own breathing. She felt the great weight of the hill above her, and instead of feeling trapped, she felt protected. The earth was her roof, her walls, her shield. The old man came once during the deepest part of the winter. A blizzard had been raging for 3 days. She had not left the mine. She heard a noise at the entrance and saw him crawling through the opening, covered in snow. He shook the snow from his coat. He carried a large, burlap sack. He opened it and emptied a dozen large potatoes onto her floor. He looked at her, at the warm, dry room, the steaming pot over the fire. He saw her woodpile, her stores of food. He saw the blanket of pelts, now large enough to cover her completely. He saw that she was not just surviving the winter. She was living in it, comfortably and securely. He stayed for an hour, sitting by her fire. Neither of them spoke. He accepted a cup of hot broth she offered him. He drank it slowly. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with a shared understanding. He was the teacher. She was the student who had learned the lesson. When the storm broke, he stood to leave. He paused at the doorway and looked back at her. For the first time, he spoke. His voice was a low rasp, rough from disuse. "Good," he said. That was all. Then he was gone. She stood in her doorway, watching his tracks in the fresh snow until they disappeared into the trees. The single word echoed in the quiet room. It was more praise than she had ever received in her life. Spring arrived slowly. The snow melted, swelling the creek. The first green shoots pushed through the cold earth. The world outside her cave came back to life. She felt a shift within herself as well. The winter had been a crucible. She had endured it. She had prevailed. The sense of constant, gnawing anxiety that had followed her from the orphanage was gone. It was replaced by a quiet confidence. She knew how to feed herself. She knew how to keep warm. She knew the strength of her own two hands. One afternoon, a man from the town was tracking a deer that had been wounded. He was the blacksmith, the one who had traded her the pot for scrap metal. He followed the trail into the woods near her hill, farther than he usually went. He saw the thin wisp of smoke rising from the ground and, curious, he approached. He saw the screened entrance to the mine. He was cautious. He thought it might be a den for a bear or a mountain lion. He called out, "Anyone in there?" His voice was loud in the quiet woods. She was inside, grinding cornmeal. She heard him and froze. She had not spoken to anyone but the old man in months. She did not answer. He called out again, then, seeing the path worn to the entrance, he grew bolder. He peered through the timber screen. His eyes took a moment to adjust to the dim light. He saw her. A young woman, standing in a clean, ordered room. He saw the stone walls, the paved floor, the fireplace with its clever hood. He saw the neat sleeping platform, the table, the shelves laden with supplies. He was stunned into silence. This was not a vagrant's hovel. This was a home, carved out of the rock. He saw the girl who stood before him. She was no longer the scrawny, frightened child he had traded with. She was thin, yes, but she stood straight. Her eyes were steady. There was a competence in her posture, in the way she held the grinding stone in her hand. "You live here?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. She gave a single, sharp nod. "You built this?" he asked. She nodded again. He stared at the construction, at the way the stones were laid, the smooth finish of the clay walls. As a smith, he understood work. He understood shaping raw materials into something useful. He recognized the skill and the immense labor that had gone into this place. "By yourself?" She hesitated for a moment. She thought of the old man. But the work, the day-in, day-out work, had been hers alone. She nodded a third time. He backed away from the entrance slowly. He did not say another word. He turned and walked back toward the town, forgetting about the deer. The story spread through the town. At first, people didn't believe it. The crazy girl from the orphanage, living in the old collapsed mine. But the blacksmith was a sober, respected man. He did not tell tall tales. He described what he had seen. The order. The cleanliness. The sheer industry of it. A few other people ventured out, curious. The town sheriff. The woman who ran the general store. They did not approach the entrance. They stood at a distance, looking at the place where the smoke rose, at the faint path leading into the hill. They talked about it in low voices. The girl they had cast out, the girl they had assumed was long gone or dead, had done something impossible. She had taken a place of darkness and abandonment and made it into a fortress of solitude and self-reliance. The town's view of her began to change. She was no longer an object of pity or scorn. She was an object of wonder. A mystery. They still did not understand her. But they began, reluctantly, to respect her. The seasons turned again. Summer, then another autumn. Her home was a constant, a fixed point in a changing world. She expanded it further, carving out a small, cold room at the back of the water seep. It was a natural cellar, a place to keep roots and preserved meat cool through the warmer months. She built a stone cistern to collect the clean water, ensuring she had a larger supply. Her life was one of labor, but it was a satisfying labor. Every task had a direct and immediate result. If she repaired a tool, it worked better. If she planted the seeds from a wild good, a vine grew. If she strengthened a wall, her home became safer. The old man's visits became less frequent. He seemed to understand that she no longer needed his direct instruction. He would appear sometimes at a distance, watching her work, a silent, approving presence. He left a final gift one autumn evening. It was a heavy wool blanket, thick and clean. It was not something he could have made. It was store-bought. It represented a great cost. He laid it, folded, on the rock outside her entrance. She saw him as he was leaving, his back to her, walking toward the setting sun. She knew, somehow, that it was the last time she would see him. He did not look back. She took the blanket inside. It smelled of lanolin and cedar. She spread it on her sleeping platform. It was a gift of comfort, but also a gesture of completion. It was his acknowledgement that her education was finished. The world outside continued on its own path. The town grew slightly. A new family moved in. The stagecoach route was changed. These things meant nothing to her. Her world was the mine, the forest, and the sky above them. One day, a family's wagon broke an axle on the road a mile from her hill. The father, a newcomer to the area, was trying to fix it. His wife and two small children huddled nearby, cold and scared as evening approached. He saw her smoke and, desperate, came for help. He expected a prospector's shack. He found her home. He stood at the entrance, his hat in his hands, speechless at what he saw. She looked at him, at his worried face. She looked past him, at the woman and children shivering in the twilight. She did not invite him in. She simply went to her fire, took a burning branch, and walked out of the mine. She led him back to his family. She helped him start a large, warm fire for them. She went back to her home and returned with her new wool blanket and a pot of hot stew. She gave it to the mother. "Thank you," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "God bless you." The girl said nothing. She just nodded and returned to her cave. The next day, after the man had repaired his wagon and left, the blacksmith came out. He was not alone. 2 other men from the town were with him. They did not come to stare. They came with tools and supplies. The roof of the old stable collapsed, the blacksmith said, not looking at her directly, but at her handiwork. "Good timbers in it." Going to waste, they spent the day dragging heavy, solid beams from the town to the clearing outside her mine. They stacked them neatly. They also left a sack of flour, a side of bacon, and a new, sharp axe. They did not ask for payment. They did not ask for thanks. It was an offering. A gesture of respect from the world that had once turned its back on her. They saw her not as an outcast, but as a builder. Someone who understood the value of good timber. Someone who knew how to make something from nothing. She stood in the entrance of her home, watching them leave. The pile of timbers was a testament to how far she had come. She had not asked for their help. She had not sought their approval. She had simply worked. She had solved the problems in front of her, one at a time. The result of that work was a life. A solid, real, and independent life. She ran a hand over the new timbers. They were square-cut and seasoned, far better than the splintered, rotten wood she had scavenged from the mine itself. With these, she could build a proper door, a roof over the entrance chamber to keep the snow out completely. She could build better shelves, a stronger workbench. The possibilities unfolded in her mind, a map of future work. Her home was not finished. It would never be finished. It was a living thing, something that would grow and change as she grew and changed. She looked out at the landscape. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in shades of orange and purple. The wind was cool on her face. She was a part of this place now. Her sweat was mixed with the clay in the walls. Her strength was in the stone she had lifted. Her story was written in the silence of the mine. She was no longer the girl who had been cast out. She was the woman who had built a home in the heart of a hill. She turned from the fading light and went back inside. The air was cool and still. The lantern cast its steady, golden glow on the stone table. Her iron pot sat by the fire, ready for the evening meal. Everything was in its place. Everything had a purpose. There was no fear here. There was no loneliness. There was only the quiet dignity of a life made with her own hands. She sat at her table. She picked up the new axe, testing its weight, its perfect balance. It was a good tool. Tomorrow, there would be work to do.